The quiet letter. The evening light fell gently across Keanu Reeves's small wooden desk as he sat in silence, a pen resting loosely between his fingers. Outside his window, Los Angeles glowed with its usual restlessness, but inside his home there was only stillness. He had been staring at the same envelope for almost an hour. His name was written in delicate handwriting, familiar yet distant, like a whisper from the past. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, and he had avoided opening it, afraid that whatever waited inside would pull him back into emotions he thought he had buried long ago. The name on the envelope was Sandra Bullock. He smiled softly, almost involuntarily. It had been years since they last spoke, years since their lives had gone in different directions after sharing the kind of bond that never needed words. She had been his friend, his co-star, and his quiet confidant during moments when fame had felt like a cage. But this letter felt different. It wasn't a text or an email. It carried weight, intention, and something unspoken that pulled at his heart. As he finally opened it, the sound of paper tearing filled the silence. Her words began simply, but every line carried emotion. Dear Keanu, there's something I never told you. Something that's been sitting in my heart since the day we finished that film together. It's not easy to say, but I feel like it's time you knew. He stopped reading for a moment, his chest tightening. Her writing had always been thoughtful, but this tone was heavier, almost trembling. He continued slowly, his eyes moving across the lines like tracing old memories. You once told me that silence can sometimes say more than words. Maybe that's why we never talked about what was really happening between us. But there's a truth about that time, something I discovered long after we said goodbye. I don't know if you remember that night after the shoot, when you gave your jacket to the old man sitting outside the studio. What happened after changed my life. Keanu leaned back, confused. He remembered that night vaguely. A long shoot had ended, and an elderly homeless man had been sitting by the studio gate, shivering. Keanu had given him his jacket and quietly walked away. It had felt like nothing more than a small act of kindness. But now, reading Sandra's words, it seemed that act had a story behind it, one he never knew. That man wasn't a stranger to me. And what you did that night set off a chain of events that neither of us could have imagined. The sentence stopped there, followed by an ink blot, as if she had hesitated or cried before finishing the page. Keanu turned the letter over, but it ended abruptly. There was no explanation, no closure, only a request. Please meet me in the same park we used to visit during lunch breaks. There's something you need to see. It's about him and about you. No signature, no date. Only her familiar handwriting fading at the edges. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his jacket pocket. For a long while, he just sat there thinking about how time had a strange way of bringing back unfinished stories. He remembered the park clearly. The quiet corner bench, the lake, the laughter they used to share between takes. He hadn't been there in years. He didn't know why, but something deep inside told him this wasn't just nostalgia. It felt like something much bigger, something that had been waiting to resurface. The next morning, the air was cool and soft. Keanu wore a dark hoodie and sunglasses, not because he wanted to hide, but because anonymity had become a kind of peace. When he reached the park, the memories came rushing back. The wooden benches, the sound of children playing, the familiar rustle of leaves. And then, sitting beneath a tree near the lake, he saw her. Sandra looked older but not tired. Her face still carried the same kindness he remembered, but her eyes seemed heavier, as if they had witnessed too many silent storms. When she saw him, she smiled softly. That same smile that had once made every long shoot bearable. You came, she said. Standing slowly, you wrote. He replied with a quiet laugh, his voice low and warm. How could I not? For a moment, there was only the sound of birds and wind between them. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out an old, worn photograph. She handed it to him without a word. It showed a younger man, bearded, frail, sitting in front of a small bookstore. His eyes looked kind but tired. Keanu recognized him immediately. It was the man from that night, the same man he had given his jacket to. That's him, he said softly. The man outside the studio, Sandra nodded. His name was Peter. He used to work at that same bookstore where I bought my first screenplay. He helped me when I was just starting out. I didn't know what happened to him until years later. After you gave him your jacket, something changed for him. He found a letter in the pocket. Your note! Keanu frowned. My note? She smiled faintly. You wrote something simple. Stay warm, stranger. The world still needs you. He blinked, trying to remember. Yes. He had scribbled it quickly on a torn receipt before slipping it into the jacket pocket. It had been nothing more than an instinct, a small gesture, but her tone made it sound like it meant far more. He took that note, she continued, and he framed it inside the bookstore window after he rebuilt his life. The local paper wrote a story about it. They called it The Note That Saved a Soul. Keanu's throat tightened. I never knew. You weren't supposed to, she said gently. But that's not all. Before Peter passed away, he left something behind for you. From her bag, she pulled out a small sealed box. Its edges were old, but the paper around it was neatly folded. He gave this to me years ago. Said I should give it to you if we ever met again. Keanu hesitated before taking it. The box was light, but carried a strange weight. Inside, he found an old photograph. Himself standing outside the studio that night, unaware that someone had taken the picture. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper with a few lines written in shaky handwriting. You reminded me that kindness can wake the dead part of the soul. Because of you, I found my daughter again. Her name is Elena. She wants to thank you, too. Keanu looked up sharply. His daughter? Sandra nodded slowly. That's why I called you here. She's here today. She turned toward the park entrance. A young woman in her mid-20s stood quietly holding a small flower in her hand. Her eyes carried the same depth as the man in the photo. When she saw Keanu, she smiled nervously and walked toward him. You don't know me, she said softly, her voice trembling. But you saved my father's life. I wanted to thank you in person. Keanu's eyes softened. He took a slow breath, struggling to find words. I didn't save anyone, he whispered. I just gave him a jacket. The young woman smiled. You gave him hope. Silence hung between them. Sandra watched quietly, her expression unreadable. Then she said, almost in a whisper, Keanu, there's more. Elena isn't just here to thank you. She has something else, a message your mother left behind before she passed. He froze. The sound of her name, the reminder of that wound he had never truly healed, hit him like a wave. My mother? He asked, his voice breaking slightly. How would she? Sandra placed a gentle hand on his arm. Just listen to her, please. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a small folded letter sealed in blue wax. The initials carved on it were unmistakable, his mother's. Keanu took it slowly, his hands shaking as he turned it over. For a long moment he couldn't move. He had thought all her letters were gone. This one had found its way back to him through a stranger's kindness, through a chain of coincidences that now felt like fate. He opened the envelope. My dear son, if this ever finds you, know that every act of kindness carries a ripple far beyond what you can see. Never stop believing that your gentleness is your strength. The world may not always understand it, but it will always need it. His vision blurred. The park faded. The sounds grew distant, and all he could feel was the quiet warmth of the words that connected past and present in one fragile thread. When he looked up, Sandra was watching him with tears in her eyes. Now, do you understand why I had to bring you here? She whispered. It wasn't just about the past. It's about what you left behind without even knowing. Keanu didn't speak. He just nodded slowly, his jaw tightening as he folded the letter against his chest. But before he could say anything else, Elena hesitated and added softly, There's something else you should know. The bookstore, my father's store, it wasn't just his. It belonged to someone who knew your family, and she's still alive. The words hung heavy in the air. Keanu turned sharply. Who? She looked at Sandra, then back at him. Your mother's oldest friend. And that's when Keanu realized. This was only the beginning. The woman who remembered, the air in the park had grown still after Elena's words. Keanu stood silent, his heart thudding softly in his chest, his mind searching for meaning. The idea that someone still alive knew his mother, and that this person was somehow connected to the same man whose life he had unknowingly touched, felt almost impossible. But the way Elena spoke, calm and certain, told him it wasn't a coincidence. He looked at Sandra, who seemed equally surprised, though not entirely. Her eyes flickered with something between curiosity and quiet concern. "Who is she?" Sandra finally asked, her voice steady but low. "This friend of his mother?" Elena took a breath before answering. "Her name is Margaret Nolan. My father said she used to visit his bookstore often. She would sit in the corner and read for hours, always asking about a boy named Keanu. He told me she spoke of him with pride, like she was keeping some promise." Keanu's expression softened. Margaret Nolan. The name stirred faint memories, echoes of laughter and warmth. He remembered her faintly from his childhood in Toronto, a woman with gentle eyes and a patient smile who used to visit his mother's small apartment. She was an artist, quiet and mysterious, always sketching something in her worn notebook. She had disappeared from his life after his mother's passing, and he never saw her again. "Where is she now?" he asked quietly. "She lives just outside Santa Monica," Elena said. "Still runs the old bookstore my father rebuilt. She doesn't go out much anymore, but she asked to see you. She said there's something your mother wanted you to have, a truth she couldn't tell while she was alive." The words, "a truth she couldn't tell," made Keanu's stomach tighten. He had learned long ago that truth often came with pain, but something about this moment felt necessary, like a door he had to open no matter what waited behind it. He looked at Sandra, who simply nodded. "Let's go," she said softly. "You shouldn't face this alone." The drive to Santa Monica was quiet. The ocean stretched wide beside the road, waves breaking softly against the rocks. The sun hung low, painting the sky with warm shades of orange and gold. Keanu drove slowly, lost in thought. Every mile seemed to pull him closer, not only to the woman from his past, but also to memories he had locked away for years. "Do you ever think," Sandra said after a while, "that some people come back into our lives only when we're ready to hear them?" He glanced at her, thoughtful. "Maybe. Or maybe they never really leave. They just wait for us to stop running." She smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "You always say things like that," she said softly. "Simple, but they stay with you," he chuckled lightly. "That's because silence teaches you what words can't." They drove on, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. It was strange, he thought, how time had changed them both but hadn't erased the ease of their connection. She had always been able to ground him when his thoughts grew heavy. And now, as they neared the bookstore, he felt that quiet strength beside him again. The bookstore stood tucked between two narrow buildings, its windows filled with stacks of second-hand novels and handwritten notes taped to the glass. The sign above the door read, "The Lantern Room." Its paint was faded, but it had a warmth that made it feel alive. A small bell chimed as they stepped inside, and the scent of old paper and sea salt filled the air. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with silver hair tied neatly at the back. Her eyes lifted slowly as they entered, and for a moment, she simply stared at Keanu, as if seeing a ghost from long ago. "You came," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You really came?" Keanu froze. "Margaret?" She nodded, her eyes glistening. "You have your mother's eyes," she said softly. And her way of standing, too. "It's like she's right here." He walked closer, emotion building in his chest. "I remember you," he said. "You used to draw in our kitchen while she cooked." Margaret smiled faintly. "And you used to steal her cookies before they cooled." "She never had the heart to scold you." Sandra watched quietly as they spoke. There was something sacred about the moment, two lives reconnecting after years of silence, both carrying the weight of someone they loved. "Why did you want to see me?" Keanu asked gently. Margaret gestured toward a small wooden box on the counter. It was old, the kind of box that seemed to have stories locked inside it. "Your mother left this with me," she said. "She said I was to give it to you only when you were ready to understand." Keanu hesitated. "Understand what?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Your mother carried a secret, Keanu. One that shaped her life and yours. She wanted to protect you from it, but she always feared it would find you eventually." He stared at the box, uncertain whether he wanted to open it. "What kind of secret?" he asked quietly. "The kind that changes how you see everything," Margaret said, "about who she really was, and about the man who was supposed to raise you." The room fell silent. Sandra glanced at Keanu, watching the color drain from his face. "You mean my father?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. Margaret nodded. "Yes, but not the one you think." He didn't speak. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the box. When he opened it, inside lay a photograph, a young woman holding a baby, standing beside a man in a military uniform. The woman was his mother. The man was a stranger. "That's not my father," Keanu whispered. Margaret's eyes softened. "No," she said gently. "He was the man your mother loved before she met the one who raised you. She never told you because he disappeared before you were born." Keanu stared at the photo, his mind spinning. "Who was he?" "His name was Daniel Morris," Margaret said. "He worked as a medic overseas. He and your mother met in London during her art studies. She thought he had died in an accident, but years later, she found out he had survived. By then it was too late. You were already growing up with your stepfather." He closed his eyes, his breath shallow. "Why didn't she tell me?" "Because she didn't want you to feel torn between two worlds," Margaret replied softly. "She wanted you to believe you belonged completely where you were." Sandra stepped closer, her hand lightly touching Keanu's arm. "Sometimes people hide the truth not because they're afraid, but because they love too deeply to cause pain." Margaret nodded. "She carried that love until the day she died. But she asked me to tell you this, Keanu. Your kindness comes from him. Daniel was the same way. Always helping, always giving. She said that when you started living like that, she knew his spirit had found its way into you." Keanu's throat tightened. He looked down at the photograph again, tracing the edges of his mother's smile. Everything he thought he knew about his past was shifting, but somehow it made sense. The compassion he had always felt drawn to. It wasn't something he learned from fame or experience. "It was something born into him. There's one more thing," Margaret said quietly. She handed him a faded envelope sealed in red wax. "This letter was written by your real father. It arrived years after your mother passed. I never had the courage to open it." Keanu stared at it for a long moment, unable to move. He could feel Sandra's gaze on him, warm and steady. Finally, he took the envelope and carefully broke the seal. Inside, the handwriting was old and uneven, but the words were clear. "My son, if you ever read this, know that I never stopped searching for you. Your mother kept you safe, and I am grateful she did. I lived a life of silence because I didn't want to bring war into your world. If you've grown into a man of kindness, then you've already fulfilled what I could never give you. The world will take from you, my boy, but never let it take your gentleness." As he read the final line, his vision blurred with tears. "The world will take from you, but never let it take your gentleness." He folded the letter carefully, holding it close to his heart. Sandra placed a gentle hand on his back. "Your mother and father both wanted you to live with light, not bitterness. And that's what you've done." He nodded silently, overwhelmed. For a while, none of them spoke. The bookstore was quiet except for the faint hum of the waves outside. Then Margaret said something that made both Keanu and Sandra look up. "There's one last thing you need to see," she whispered. Something hidden in the back room. "Your mother painted it before she died. She said it would explain everything she couldn't say." She led them to a narrow hallway at the back of the store. Her steps slow but steady. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with canvases and drawings. At the center stood a large covered painting. Keanu walked closer. Margaret nodded for him to uncover it. When he pulled the cloth away, he froze. Sandra gasped quietly. The painting showed a small child standing on a shore, reaching toward the ocean, his reflection forming two figures, one of his mother, one of his father, both watching him from the waves. Beneath it, written in small letters, were the words, "What love hides, truth reveals." Keanu stood there, speechless. The message was clear. His mother had never wanted him to search for the truth because she knew it would eventually find him. As he stared at the painting, something else caught his eye. A small envelope taped to the back of the canvas, marked only with Sandra's name. He turned to her slowly, confusion crossing his face. "Why would she leave something for you?" Sandra stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the envelope. "I don't know," she whispered, "but maybe it's time to find out." She opened it carefully, and as her eyes scanned the first line, her face went pale. "Keanu," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about you. It's about both of us." The letter meant for both. The dim light from the back room fell across Sandra's trembling hands as she held the old letter. Keanu watched her silently, his chest tightening at the look on her face. She wasn't just surprised. She was shaken, as if the words in front of her had reached a place she didn't expect anyone to touch. He stepped closer, his voice soft. "What does it say?" Sandra didn't answer at first. She ran her fingers along the fragile paper, her eyes unfocused, lost somewhere between memory and disbelief. Then she took a slow breath and began reading aloud, her voice barely steady. "Dear Sandra, if you're reading this, it means Keanu has found the truth about his father, and it also means you've stayed the person I always believed you would be." Keanu froze. His mother's handwriting flowed across the page, delicate, full of warmth, yet carrying a quiet authority. He hadn't known his mother and Sandra had ever met, but now, hearing her name written in his mother's hand, it was as if two worlds he had kept separate were slowly colliding. Sandra continued reading, her eyes glistening. "There is something you don't know about that time on set. I watched how you looked after him when no one else did. You reminded me of myself at his age, strong but gentle in ways people often overlook. You gave him peace when he couldn't find it alone." She stopped for a moment, blinking back tears. "She's talking about you," she whispered, glancing at him. "Your mother knew how much you were struggling back then." Keanu lowered his gaze. "That was a difficult year," he said quietly. "She must have seen something I couldn't hide." Sandra nodded and kept reading. "You and Keanu share something rare. You both know loss, yet you both carry light. One day he will need you again, not as an actress beside him, but as a mirror. When the world grows cold, remind him who he is." The words sank into the room like a heartbeat. The silence that followed was heavy, yet strangely peaceful. Keanu looked at Sandra, and for a long moment, neither spoke. There had always been a quiet bond between them, something that never needed to be explained. But hearing it acknowledged by his mother, from beyond years of silence, gave it an entirely new weight. Sandra's voice broke softly as she finished the letter. "If you ever doubt why you crossed paths, remember this: souls don't meet by chance. They meet because they recognize something familiar in each other, something that the world cannot take away." When she folded the letter, tears were already sliding down her cheeks. Keanu reached out and gently took her hand, his touch steady and calm. "She always believed things like that," he said quietly. "She used to say people are threads in the same pattern even if they don't see the whole picture." Sandra gave a weak smile. She was right. Maybe we were meant to find this together. Margaret stood quietly in the corner, her expression soft. "Your mother knew how deeply you cared for each other," she said. "She told me once that their bond on screen wasn't just acting, it was healing." Sandra's eyes flickered. "She said that?" Margaret nodded. "She said you reminded her of the way she once looked at Keanu's father, full of hope, but afraid of breaking something precious." The words struck deep. Sandra turned away, trying to steady her breath. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. He remembered those years vividly. The late-night talks, the unspoken affection, the way they would laugh between scenes just to forget the pain waiting outside the studio lights. They had both lost so much back then, yet in each other's company, they had found quiet understanding. "Your mother saw what we didn't want to admit," Sandra whispered. "That we were both trying to save each other without saying it." Keanu's eyes softened. "Maybe we still are." For a while there was only silence. The painting behind them seemed almost alive under the flickering light, the waves on the canvas glimmering like they were moving. Margaret stepped closer to it and touched the edge gently. "There's something more," she said softly. "Something hidden behind the frame. I found it years ago but never knew who it was meant for." She reached behind the canvas and pulled out a small folded note, yellowed with age. When she handed it to Keanu, his heart skipped. On the front, written in his mother's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For when you both are ready." He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sentence. The truth that connects you will not be found in the past, but in what you've both forgotten to say. Sandra frowned slightly. What does that mean? Keanu looked at the letter for a long moment before replying. I think it means she knew we left something unfinished. Sandra's lips parted, but she didn't speak. There were things she wanted to say, things that had been buried for years under fear, timing, and silence. But before she could gather her thoughts, Margaret spoke again. There's something else, Keanu, she said softly. Something your father asked me to give you, though I didn't understand it then. She reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small tin box, dented but neatly preserved. Inside was an old cassette tape labeled simply, "For my son." Keanu stared at it, disbelief flickering across his face. Is that his voice? Margaret nodded. It should be. I never played it. I didn't think it was my place. The room grew heavy with anticipation. Sandra touched his arm gently. Do you want to play it now? He hesitated, then nodded. Margaret handed him an old, portable cassette player from the shelf. As the tape clicked into place, a faint static filled the air. Then came a voice. Rough, tired, but unmistakably human. If you're hearing this, my boy, it means time has caught up to what I could never say. Your mother was my world, and you were the proof that light can come from chaos. I was not there to watch you grow, but I carried your face in my heart every day. Keanu closed his eyes, the sound of his father's voice hitting him like a wave. Sandra's hand tightened around his, grounding him. The world will try to teach you that strength means not feeling. Don't believe it. Real strength is the courage to care even when it hurts. If you ever doubt yourself, look for the people who make you feel at peace. That's where truth lives. The tape clicked softly, then went silent. Keanu sat frozen for a moment, staring at the player. The air felt charged with something sacred, like time itself had paused to let the past speak. Finally, he whispered, He sounds like he knew me before I existed. Sandra smiled through her tears. Maybe he did, Margaret sighed softly, her voice almost a whisper. Your mother said he could always sense things others couldn't. Maybe that's where you get it from. Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes distant. Maybe. But as he stood, he noticed something strange. Taped to the inside of the cassette box was a faded receipt. His father's handwriting was scrawled on the back. Find the place where the sea meets the bell. The truth waits there. He turned it over, confused. The sea meets the bell? Margaret frowned. That sounds like a landmark. There's a place up north called Bell's Cove, a cliffside near Malibu with an old church bell by the sea. Sandra's eyes widened. We used to film near there, remember? During that early shoot? He nodded. I remember. That's where we shot the scene that wasn't supposed to feel like acting. She smiled faintly. Because it wasn't. He slipped the note into his pocket. Then that's where we go next. Margaret watched them leave, her hand pressed to her heart. Be careful, she whispered as they stepped into the fading light. The truth always costs something. The drive toward Bell's Cove was quiet, the sky turning deep gold as the sun sank lower. The ocean shimmered beside them, endless and alive. Keanu kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the folded note in his lap. Sandra looked out the window, her voice soft. Do you think she meant for us to go there together? I think she meant for us to finish what we started, he said quietly. They arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air smelled of salt and wind. The sound of waves echoed against the cliffs. At the edge of the cove stood an old stone arch with a rusted bell hanging above it. Keanu stepped closer, the sand crunching under his boots. The bell swayed gently in the wind, its clapper striking softly, one low, haunting note. The sea meets the bell, he whispered. This must be it. As they stood there, a gust of wind blew, and something small rolled from beneath the arch. A weathered glass bottle, half buried in sand. Keanu bent down and picked it up. Inside was a piece of paper sealed tightly with wax. He broke it open and unrolled the note. The handwriting was familiar. To my son, and to the woman who will help him see what love truly is. Sandra covered her mouth, her eyes wide. Keanu read on, his voice trembling. You are both pieces of a story that began before either of you knew. I can't tell you what waits at the end, but I can tell you this. When the truth reveals itself, it will ask you to choose between what was and what could be." He stopped, staring at the last line, written faintly beneath the folds. "And when the bell rings 3 times, follow where the light falls." The wind grew stronger, waves crashing harder against the rocks. Then, clang. The bell rang once. Sandra's hand gripped his arm. Clang! It rang again, louder this time. Keanu looked around, his pulse racing. "Do you hear that?" Before she could answer, clang. The third strike echoed through the cove, and at that moment, the last rays of the sun broke through the clouds, casting a narrow beam of light across the cliffs, revealing something hidden behind the rocks, an entrance, faintly glowing with golden light. Sandra gasped softly. "Keanu, what is that?" He stared at it, heart pounding, the letter still in his hand. "I don't know," he whispered, "but I think we're about to find out." The hidden chamber, the golden beam stretched across the rocky cliffside, its shimmer reflecting off the waves below. Keanu and Sandra stood frozen for a moment, staring at the faint glow that pulsed from a narrow crevice behind the stone arch. The sound of the bell still echoed faintly through the wind, like an ancient rhythm guiding them forward. Keanu stepped closer first, his eyes narrowing as he brushed away some sand from the base of the rocks. Beneath the shifting grains, he could see the faint outline of a door, small, almost hidden by the years. Its surface was carved with strange markings, worn smooth by salt and time. "How did no one ever notice this?" Sandra whispered. "Maybe it wasn't meant for anyone to find," he said softly. "Except us." The carvings seemed almost alive under the fading light. There were 2 initials near the top, KM, and below them an inscription that read, "Truth waits for the ones who come together." Sandra touched the words with her fingertips. "Your mother's handwriting," she murmured. Keanu nodded slowly. "She must have known we'd come here someday." As if responding to their presence, the faint glow from the crevice grew stronger, spreading along the stone lines like veins of light. Then, without warning, the door gave a low rumble and slid open just enough to reveal a dark passage descending into the earth. They exchanged a glance, half fear, half resolve. "You don't have to come," he said quietly. "You think I'd let you walk into a mystery without me?" She replied, her tone calm but fierce. "Besides, your mother said I'd have to remind you who you are." He smiled faintly. "Then stay close." They stepped inside. The air was cool, almost sacred. The sound of the waves faded behind them, replaced by the soft echo of their footsteps. The tunnel walls were lined with sea-polished stones, and faint streaks of gold ran through them like veins of light guiding the way. After a few steps, the passage opened into a small, circular chamber. The walls were covered with murals, paintings of waves, stars, and faces half hidden in light. At the center stood a pedestal with an old wooden box resting upon it, much like the one Keanu had opened in the bookstore. A single candle flickered beside it. Though no one had been there in years, Sandra's breath caught. "How is that candle burning?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Maybe it's been waiting." He approached the pedestal carefully and lifted the lid of the box. Inside were several old photographs, a folded journal, and a locket. When he touched the locket, something inside him stirred, a feeling both familiar and strange. He opened it. Inside was a small photograph of his mother holding him as a baby, her expression filled with both joy and sadness. Opposite her image was another, his father, younger and smiling, wearing the same jacket he'd seen in the earlier photograph. Beneath the locket was a note, folded neatly, written in the same handwriting he had come to recognize. "To my son, and to the one who stayed beside him. If you are here, you have found the truth. This place holds what was meant to remain hidden, not because it was shameful, but because it was sacred." Keanu's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading. "I built this chamber with Margaret's help after Daniel's death. The sea took him before he could meet you. This was his sanctuary, a place where he kept his letters, his hopes, and the story of how he found me. I wanted you to find it only when you had learned to live with both light and loss." He stopped reading for a moment, breathing deeply. Sandra watched him quietly, her expression soft but pained. "Your mother was protecting you," she whispered. "Not from pain, but from too much truth at once." He nodded. "She knew I'd need time." He unfolded the rest of the note. "If Sandra is with you, then know this. You were her guardian, even when she didn't realize it. The world will always try to dim the light in those who care too deeply. Help each other remember that kindness is not weakness. It is the only strength that survives." His voice broke slightly at the last line. Sandra's eyes glistened. "She knew us better than we knew ourselves." "She always did," he said softly. Then, beneath the note, he noticed something else. An old, worn page from a journal with faint ink markings. It was his father's handwriting this time. "I dreamed of building a home by the sea, a place where stories outlast pain. If you ever find this, it means the circle is complete. The truth is not in the words, but in what survives them." As he finished reading, the candle flame flickered, casting a shadow across the far wall. Sandra turned and gasped softly. On the wall behind them was a mural neither of them had noticed before. It showed two figures standing at the edge of a sea, facing the horizon, their reflections forming a single shape in the water, like two souls merged into one. Beneath the image were the words, "The answer is not who we were, but who we become together." Keanu's throat tightened. "She painted this," he said quietly. "It's her work." Sandra nodded. "And maybe this was her final message." They stood there in silence, the sound of distant waves faintly echoing through the chamber walls. Keanu ran his hand across the mural, his fingertips tracing the outlines. "She wanted us to see this," he whispered, "to understand that everything, the letters, the secrets, even this place, wasn't just about the past. It was about what we'd choose to carry forward. And what we'd let go," Sandra added softly. Her words hung between them. He turned to her then, his eyes deep with emotion. "You've always been the one who reminded me what matters, even when I tried to disappear into silence." She gave a faint smile. "And you've always been the one who showed me that silence can be healing, not empty." For a long time, neither of them moved. The chamber seemed to breathe with them, the candlelight flickering gently as if responding to their presence. Then, suddenly, a low hum filled the air. The mural's paint began to shimmer, the gold lines glowing brighter, revealing new patterns that hadn't been visible before. At the bottom, hidden beneath layers of faded paint, appeared one more message. Sandra leaned closer, squinting at the words, "The light will reveal the final truth when the sea forgives the sky." "What does that even mean?" she whispered. Keanu shook his head slowly. "Maybe it's not meant to be understood here." As the glow dimmed again, they noticed something else, the faint outline of a door on the far side of the chamber, hidden behind the mural. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Keanu pressed his hand against it. The stone was cold but shifted slightly under his touch. A soft vibration passed through the wall, followed by a low click. The door slid open, revealing a small, narrow path leading toward the sound of rushing water. "You sure you want to go farther?" Sandra asked quietly. He looked at her, his voice calm but resolute. "I think this is where she wanted us to go last." They stepped into the narrow path. The air grew cooler, and the sound of waves became louder until they reached an open space carved into the cliff itself. It was a natural cavern, open to the ocean, the moonlight pouring through a wide gap above. In the center stood a stone bench facing the sea. Carved into the surface were two names, Daniel Morris and Lucia Reeves. Beneath them, an inscription read, "The sea forgives the sky." Sandra placed her hand over her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "It's a memorial," she whispered, "for both of them." Keanu knelt before the bench, tracing their names with his fingers. "They built this together," he said quietly. "Before he died." He took a deep breath, his voice breaking. "She kept this hidden so I could find it when I was ready to understand what love really means." Sandra knelt beside him, resting her hand on his shoulder. And do you understand it now? He looked out toward the sea, where moonlight met the horizon in a seamless line. Love isn't about holding on, he said softly. It's about continuing what they started. They sat there in silence, the waves brushing against the stones like a heartbeat. Keanu placed the locket on the bench between the two names, and the moment it touched the surface, the moonlight seemed to flare brighter, reflecting across the water like a path of silver fire. "The sea forgives the sky," Sandra whispered again. "Maybe it means love forgives everything." Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "Or maybe it means love never ends. It just changes form." The wind picked up, carrying the faint chime of the bell from above. It echoed through the cavern 3 times, soft and pure, as if the past itself had finally found peace. But as they turned to leave, Sandra noticed something shimmering near the entrance, a small metal key embedded in the rock, half hidden under the light. She picked it up and turned it over. Engraved on it were the same initials, KM, and a small symbol that looked like a star inside a wave. "Another clue?" she asked quietly. Keanu took the key, his gaze thoughtful. "No," he said softly. "I think it's an invitation." She looked at him. "To what?" He slipped the key into his pocket and glanced back toward the glowing sea. To finish what they couldn't. He didn't know yet what that meant, but he could feel it. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a choice. And somewhere in the echo of the waves, his mother's voice seemed to whisper again. The truth that connects you will ask you to choose between what was and what could be. The choice between what was and what could be, the night air outside the cavern was cool and heavy with salt. Keanu and Sandra walked along the moonlit shore in silence, their shoes sinking softly into the wet sand. The bell above the cliff had gone quiet now, as if it had completed its task. Behind them, the chamber of truth stood still, hidden once more beneath the rocks and the rhythm of the tide. Sandra glanced at Keanu. His face was calm, but his eyes held the weight of everything they had discovered. The letters, the secrets, the forgiveness buried beneath years of silence. "You're quiet," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "I'm trying to listen." "To what?" "To the part of me that isn't afraid anymore." She nodded slowly, understanding without needing to ask. They reached a wooden bench near the dunes, half covered in sand and seaweed, and sat down. The waves stretched endlessly before them, black and silver under the moonlight. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "when I first wrote you that letter, I didn't know what I was expecting. I just knew there was something unfinished between us. But this was never what I imagined." Keanu's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. Maybe that's what makes it real. The truth doesn't arrive in the way we expect. It just finds us when we're ready to see it. She smiled. "Your mother would have loved to hear you say that." He turned to her. She already knew. They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that carried both sadness and peace. Then Sandra's tone shifted, gentler now, her words deliberate. "Keanu, do you think we've really found everything she wanted us to?" He thought for a moment. "I think we found what she hid, but not what she meant." "What do you mean?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small key they had found embedded in the rock. Its metal glimmered faintly in the moonlight, and the tiny engraved star inside the wave seemed almost alive. "This," he said quietly. "It doesn't open the past. It's meant for something ahead. But what?" He looked at her, his expression thoughtful, almost serene. "Maybe it's not a door. Maybe it's a choice." The next morning, they returned to Margaret's bookstore. The smell of coffee and paper filled the air, grounding them again after the night's surreal quiet. Margaret was sitting behind the counter, reading one of the old journals that had belonged to Keanu's father. When she looked up and saw them, she smiled warmly. "I was hoping you'd come back," she said. "You found the chamber, didn't you?" Keanu nodded. "We did. And we found their resting place." She exhaled softly, her eyes misting. "Then they can finally rest." He placed the small key on the counter between them. "We also found this." Margaret stared at it for a long moment, her expression changing from curiosity to recognition. I've seen that before, she whispered. Your mother showed it to me once. She said it wasn't meant for her to use. Do you know what it opens? Sandra asked. Margaret hesitated, then stood and walked to a tall wooden cabinet behind the counter. She unlocked it with a small brass key and pulled out a wrapped bundle. When she unrolled the cloth, a small black notebook appeared, its cover cracked and fragile with age. This belonged to Daniel, she said. I've kept it hidden all these years because I didn't think anyone should read it until the right time. She opened the notebook carefully. On the first page was a sketch, an outline of the same key with the same star and wave engraving. Beneath it were the words, "The key to the promise." Keanu's brow furrowed. The promise? Margaret nodded. Your father and mother made a promise before he left, to finish something together. A place for people who had lost everything. A sanctuary. He called it the Haven by the Sea. She was supposed to build it after he came back, but when he didn't, she buried the idea with the rest of her memories. Sandra's voice softened. So this key, could it be for that? Margaret handed the notebook to Keanu. Yes, and if I remember right, the land still exists. She bought it years ago but never built anything on it. Keanu flipped through the pages. There were sketches of cottages, gardens, ocean paths, and a small lighthouse drawn in careful detail, each one labeled in his father's handwriting, for the broken, for the lost, for the kind. He looked up at Sandra, emotion in his eyes. They wanted to build a place for people to heal. And now it's waiting for you to finish it, Margaret said. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft creak of the floorboards and the distant cry of gulls outside. Finally, Keanu whispered, then maybe that's what she meant by, the truth will ask you to choose between what was and what could be. Sandra nodded slowly. You can live in the past, honoring what they built in secret, or you can live their dream for them. He stared down at the sketches again, his mind racing. The drawings were simple but full of heart. A refuge by the ocean, far from fame, far from noise. His mother and father's legacy, incomplete but waiting. I think, he said softly, she wanted me to finish what they started. The next few weeks passed quietly but purposefully. Keanu and Sandra traveled to the coastal property marked in the notebook. It was a vast piece of land overlooking the Pacific, untouched, filled with wild grass and seagull cries. From the cliffs, they could see the same curve of the sea that had framed the cavern below Bell's Cove, standing there. Keanu could almost hear his mother's laughter. Soft and distant in the wind, this is it, he said. The haven by the sea, Sandra smiled. And you're going to build it? He nodded. Not for me. For them. For everyone who's ever felt lost. They spent the day walking the property, marking where the lighthouse might stand, where the garden could bloom. Keanu moved slowly, sketching ideas on a notepad, his expression calm and thoughtful. Sandra followed him, helping, suggesting, laughing when the wind snatched the papers from his hand. It was the first time in a long while that she saw him look truly at peace. As the sun began to set, painting the sky gold and crimson, they sat on a wooden log overlooking the sea. The sound of waves filled the air. You know, Sandra said quietly, this feels like something your mother would have wanted me to see. He smiled faintly. She probably knew you'd be the one person who could make me do it. That's because she trusted me with something I didn't understand until now. He turned to her, curious. What's that? She met his gaze, her voice soft. To remind you that kindness doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to what you do next. Her words hung in the air, tender and true. Keanu's eyes softened. You always had a way of saying what mattered. And you always had a way of listening like it was the first time. They both smiled. The kind of smile that held years of history behind it. But before the moment could settle into peace, Sandra's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her face changing slightly. What is it? Keanu asked. She hesitated, then showed him the screen. An email, no sender listed, just a subject line. The sea hasn't told you everything. Keanu frowned. Is this a joke? I don't think so, she said quietly. There's an attachment. She opened it. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, grainy but clear enough to recognize. It showed the same lighthouse sketch from the notebook, except this one had already been built. "That's impossible," Keanu whispered. "It doesn't exist yet." Sandra zoomed in on the image. There was a faint date in the corner. March 1981. He froze. "That's before I was born." The photo also showed two figures standing near the lighthouse, holding hands. His mother and a man who looked exactly like his father. Beneath the image were the words, "Some promises were never broken." Sandra's hand trembled slightly as she looked up at him. "Keanu, what if they already built it?" He stared at the sea, the waves crashing harder now, the sky deepening into twilight. "Then maybe," he said softly, "this isn't just about finishing their dream." She frowned. "Then what is it about?" He turned to her, the wind catching his hair, his eyes shining with something between wonder and fear. "Maybe it's about finding out what they left behind." And as the final light faded from the sky, the faint toll of the distant bell echoed again through the wind. 3 slow, deliberate chimes, calling them back to the sea. The final truth beneath the sea, the evening sky, deepened into a dark indigo as the sound of the bell faded slowly into the wind. Keanu and Sandra stood on the cliff above the Pacific, the mysterious email still glowing faintly on her phone screen. Below them, the ocean stretched endlessly, black and glimmering under the moonlight, whispering like it was trying to speak. "March 1981, Keanu murmured. "That's the year she disappeared for a while," Sandra frowned. "You mean before she came back to Canada?" He nodded. "She told everyone she had gone to paint in Europe, but now I think she was here. With him." They built the lighthouse together. The truth sank in slowly, heavy and beautiful. The dream his parents once imagined, the haven by the sea, hadn't been lost after all. It had existed, just hidden, buried under time, waiting for someone to return. Sandra turned to him, her voice soft but steady. "If they already built it, maybe it's still standing somewhere." "Maybe that's what the email means, and maybe that's where the key belongs," Keanu said, holding the small silver key between his fingers. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of waves crashing harder against the rocks. It felt like an invitation. Without another word, they headed down the narrow trail along the cliffside. The path wound steeply toward a stretch of secluded beach where the rocks formed a natural cove. The tide was low, revealing a strip of sand leading toward the dark outline of something tall and slender in the distance. As they drew closer, the moonlight caught it. A tower. Not large, but unmistakably a lighthouse. Its surface was worn with age, covered in ivy, but it stood firm against the ocean wind, proud and silent. Sandra stopped, her breath catching. "It's real," she whispered. Keanu nodded slowly. They built it. The lighthouse door was old and rusted, sealed by years of salt and storms. He stepped forward and pressed the small key into the keyhole. It turned easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The door creaked open, revealing a spiral staircase leading upward. The air inside smelled faintly of sea salt and old paper. Their footsteps echoed as they climbed, each step carrying them deeper into a part of history that had been hidden for decades. When they reached the top, they found a small circular room surrounded by glass. The lantern long gone, but the view breathtaking. Moonlight poured in through the windows, illuminating a small wooden chest sitting at the center of the floor. Keanu knelt before it, his hands trembling slightly. He opened the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each sealed and dated in careful handwriting. The first one read, "To my son, for every year I missed." His chest tightened. The letters were from his father. One for each year of his life. Sandra knelt beside him. "She must have come here after he died," she whispered. "She must have kept them safe for you." He picked one at random, dated his 10th birthday, and opened it carefully. "My boy, if this letter ever reaches you, it means your mother kept her promise. I don't know what kind of man you'll become, but I hope you grow gentle, not hardened. The world will try to measure you by what you've lost, but you'll find your strength in what you choose to give." His voice broke as he read the words. He pressed the letter to his chest, his eyes glistening. "He wrote these for me. Every year he couldn't be there." Sandra touched his arm gently, and she protected them, waiting for the right time to give them to you. Beneath the letters there was one last envelope, unmarked, sealed in gold wax. Keanu opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper with 2 simple sentences written in his mother's handwriting. "You've finally found us. Now build what we could only dream of. Don't let kindness die with memory. Let it live through what you create." Sandra's voice trembled. "She left you their unfinished dream," he nodded, tears rolling down his face, "and trusted me to finish it." As dawn broke over the horizon, the light from the rising sun spilled through the lighthouse windows. The ocean turned gold, waves glowing softly under the new morning. Keanu stood by the railing, holding the letters close. Sandra watched him quietly, her eyes full of emotion. "You know," she said, "most people spend their lives searching for meaning. You had it waiting for you all along," he smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why I never stopped searching. What will you do now?" He turned to her, the sunlight catching the edges of his face. "I'll build it. Not as a monument, but as a living place. A home for people who need what they once dreamed of. A place of peace, of second chances." She nodded, smiling through tears. "Your mother would be proud." He looked at her softly. "So would your heart," her breath caught. "Why mine?" "Because you stayed," he said simply. "Even when you didn't have to." They stood there in silence, the kind that felt sacred. Outside, the waves rose and fell like slow breathing, and for the first time, Keanu felt something lift inside him, the heaviness that had followed him through years of quiet grief. It wasn't gone, but it had softened, replaced by purpose. Months passed. The cliffs above Bell's Cove came alive with sound and movement again. Construction teams arrived, blueprints spread out across the grass. Keanu worked alongside them every day wearing a simple shirt and jeans, his hands marked with dirt and paint. He didn't give orders. He built with them, learning, helping, laughing quietly when things went wrong. Sandra visited often, documenting the process for a small, independent film. It wasn't a story about fame or nostalgia. It was about kindness, legacy, and healing. They named the project Haven by the Sea, just as his father had written. When it was finally finished, the place glowed with simple beauty. White cottages surrounded by gardens, an open hall facing the ocean, and a path leading down to the old lighthouse that had started it all. Inside the hall, framed on one wall, hung the painting his mother had created, the child standing at the shore, reaching toward the sea. Beneath it, a plaque read, "What love hides, truth reveals." During the opening ceremony, Keanu stood before a small crowd. Friends, builders, quiet strangers who had once written him letters about loss and hope. Sandra stood near the back, her hands clasped together, watching him speak. "This place," he said softly, "isn't mine. It's a continuation of something my parents began when they believed the world could still be kind. They didn't live to see it finished, but maybe that's the point. Kindness isn't meant to end. It's meant to continue through us." The crowd listened silently, the waves behind him echoing softly against the shore. "So if you ever find yourself here," he continued, "remember, it's not a place to escape the world. It's a place to remember that gentleness can survive it." Applause filled the air, gentle but sincere. Sandra smiled, her eyes glistening. She knew in that moment that this wasn't just his closure. It was hers too. As night fell, the two of them walked down to the lighthouse once more. The sky was painted with streaks of violet and silver, and the sea reflected every shade of it. Keanu unlocked the old door, the same one he had opened months before, and stepped inside with Sandra behind him. He lit a single candle and placed it near the window. "For them," he said quietly. She nodded. "And for everyone they inspired." They stood side by side, the candle flame flickering softly in the wind. Outside, the sea stretched infinite and calm, no longer a symbol of loss, but of renewal. Sandra turned to him, her voice gentle. "You know, your mother said souls don't meet by chance. Maybe we were part of the same promise, too." He smiled faintly. "I think we still are." For a long time, neither of them moved. The wind whispered through the open window, carrying with it the scent of salt and memory. And somewhere far off, the old bell rang once, clear, steady, and at peace. Keanu looked out at the horizon, his mother's words echoing in his heart. "Never let the world take your gentleness," he whispered them under his breath, a quiet vow. "I won't." The candle flame flickered once more, then steadied, its light warm and constant, reflecting in both their eyes, and as the first stars appeared above the calm sea, the haven by the sea stood tall and silent behind them, no longer a dream, but a living promise fulfilled.